Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a privilege to address you at this distinguished forum and discuss the profound question of our region, Palestine. Let me begin with the fact that the region has learned through decades of painful experience and that the world is learning again at a terrible human cost. Palestine is not one issue. Among many, Palestine is the defining question of justice in West Asia and beyond. It is the strategic and moral compass of our region. It is a test of whether international law has meaning, whether human rights have universal value, and whether global institutions exist to protect the weak or merely to rationalize the power of the strong. For generations, the Palestinian crisis was understood primarily as the consequence of an illegal occupation and the denial of an inalienable right, the right of a people to self-determination. But today, we must recognize that the crisis has moved far beyond the parameters of occupation alone. What we are witnessing in Gaza is not merely war, it is not a conflict between equal parties. It is not an unfortunate byproduct of security measures. It is the deliberate destruction of civilian life on a massive scale. It is genocide. The human cost of Israel's atrocities in Gaza has wounded the conscience of humanity. It has torn open the heart of the Muslim world. And it has also shaken millions beyond it, Christians, Jews, and people of all kinds, all faiths. We still believe that the life of a child is not a bargaining chip, that starvation is not a weapon, that hospitals are not battlefields, and that the killing of families is not self-defense. Palestine today is not simply a tragedy, it is a mirror held up to the world. It reflects not only the suffering of Palestinians, but also the moral failure of those who had the power to stop this catastrophe, and choose instead to justify it, enable it, or normalize it. But Palestine and Gaza is not only a humanitarian crisis, it has become the platform for something larger and more dangerous, an expansionist project, pursued under the banner of security. The project has three consequences, each of them profound, each of them alarming. The first consequence is global. The Israeli regime's conduct in Palestine and the impunity granted to it have deeply damaged the international legal order. We must say this clearly. The world is moving toward a condition where international law no longer is respected and governs international relations. What is perhaps most dangerous is the precedent being established that if a state has sufficient political cover and protection, it may bomb civilians, besiege populations, target infrastructures, assassinate individuals across borders, and still demand to be regarded as lawful. This is not merely a Palestinian problem, it is a global problem. We are witnessing not only the tragedy of Palestine, but the transformation of the world into a place where the law is replaced by force. The second consequence is regional. Israel's expansionist project has had a direct and destabilizing impact on the security of all countries in the region. The Israeli regime now openly violates borders. It breaches sovereignties. It assassinates official dignitaries. It conducts terrorist operations. It expands its reach in multiple theaters. And it does so not discreetly, but with a sense of entitlement, because it has learned that international accountability will not come. Let us be candid. If the Gaza issue is settled through destruction and forced displacement, if that becomes the model, then the West Bank will be the next. And accession will become policy. This is the essence of what has long been called the Greater Israel. The question, therefore, is not whether Israel's actions threaten Palestinians alone. The question is whether the region will accept a future in which borders are temporary. Sovereignty is conditional, and security is determined not by law or diplomacy, but by the ambitions of a militarized occupier. The third consequence is structural and perhaps the most dangerous. Israel's expansionist project requires that neighboring countries be weakened militarily, technologically, economically, and socially, so that the Israeli regime permanently enjoys the upper hand. Under this project, Israel is free to expand its military arsenal without limits, including weapons of mass destruction that remain outside any inspection regime. Yet other countries are demanded to disarm. Others are pressured to reduce defensive capacity. Others are punished for scientific progress. Others are sanctioned for building resilience. Nobody should be confused. This is not arms control. It is not non-proliferation. It is not security. It is the enforcement of permanent inequality. Israel must have a military, intelligence, and strategic edge, and others must remain vulnerable. This is a doctrine of domination. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why the Palestinian question is not only a humanitarian issue, it is a strategic issue. It is not only about Gaza and the West Bank. It is about the future of our region and the rules of the world. So what must be done? It is not enough to express concern. It is not enough to issue statements. It is not enough to mourn. We need a coordinated strategy of action. Legal, diplomatic, economic, and security-based, rooted in the principles of international law and collective responsibility. First, the international community must support legal mechanisms without hesitation. Second, there must be consequences for violations. We call for comprehensive and targeted sanctions against Israel, including an immediate arms embargo, the suspension of military and intelligence cooperation, restrictions on officials, and banning trade. Third, we need a credible political horizon grounded in law. The international community must affirm the end of occupation, the right of return and compensation in accordance with international law, and the establishment of a unified and independent Palestinian state, with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. Fourth, the humanitarian crisis must be treated as a matter of urgent international responsibility. Collective punishment must never be normalized. Fifth, regional states must coordinate to protect sovereignty and deter aggression. The principle must be clear. Security cannot be built on the insecurity of others. And finally, the Islamic world, the Arab world, and the nations of the global South must build a united diplomatic front. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Arab League, and the regional organizations must move beyond symbolism toward coordinated action. Legal support, diplomatic initiatives, economic measures, and strategic messaging. This is not about confrontation. It is about preventing the region from being reshaped by force. Dear colleagues, let no one miscalculate. A region cannot be kept stable by allowing one actor to act above the law. The doctrine of impunity will not produce peace. It will produce wider conflict. The path to stability is clear. Justice for Palestine, accountability for crimes, an end to occupation and apartheid, and a regional order built on sovereignty, equality, and cooperation. If the world wants peace, it must stop rewarding aggression. If the world wants stability, it must stop enabling expansionism. If the world believes in international law, it must enforce it consistently and without double standards. And if the nations of this region seek a future free from perpetual war, they must recognize this fundamental truth. Palestine is not merely a cause for solidarity. It is the indispensable cornerstone of regional security. Thank you so much for your attention.
Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi delivered a forceful keynote address at the Jazeera Forum in Doha, describing the situation in Gaza as genocide and calling for immediate international accountability against Israel. The speech, which drew attention from regional and international media, framed the Palestinian crisis not as a standalone humanitarian issue, but as what Araghchi called the defining question of justice in West Asia and the strategic and moral compass of the entire region, according to footage broadcast by Al Jazeera. Araghchi opened by arguing that the crisis in Gaza has moved far beyond the parameters of occupation. He stated that what is happening is not merely war, not a conflict between equal parties, and not an unfortunate byproduct of security measures. He described it as the deliberate destruction of civilian life on a massive scale. The foreign minister said the human cost has, in his words, wounded the conscience of humanity and torn open the heart of the Muslim world, while also shaking millions beyond it, including Christians, Jews, and people of all faiths who believe that the life of a child is not a bargaining chip and that starvation is not a weapon. He described Palestine as a mirror held up to the world, one that reflects not only the suffering of Palestinians, but also what he called the moral failure of those who had the power to stop the catastrophe and chose instead to justify it, enable it, or normalize it. He argued that Gaza has become the platform for something larger and more dangerous, an expansionist project pursued under the banner of security. The speech then shifted to what the Iranian foreign minister described as three profound consequences of Israel's conduct, each of which he called alarming. The first, according to Araghchi, is global. He argued that the impunity granted to Israel has deeply damaged the international legal order. He warned that the world is moving toward a condition where international law no longer governs international relations, and that a dangerous precedent is being established, that if a state has sufficient political cover, it may bomb civilians, besiege populations, target infrastructure, assassinate individuals across borders, and still demand to be regarded as lawful. The second consequence, Araghchi said, is regional. He accused Israel of openly violating borders, breaching sovereignties, assassinating official dignitaries, and conducting what he called terrorist operations across multiple theaters, all with a sense of entitlement because it has learned that international accountability will not come. He pointed to recent Israeli military operations in Lebanon, Syria, and the occupied territories as evidence of what he described as an expanding pattern of aggression that treats neighboring states as extensions of a battlefield with no recognized boundaries. The foreign minister was blunt in his warning about what comes next. If the Gaza issue is settled through destruction and forced displacement, he said, then the West Bank will follow and annexation will become official policy. He described this as the essence of what has long been called Greater Israel, a project he argued is already underway through settlement expansion, land confiscation, and the systematic erosion of Palestinian institutions in the occupied West Bank. Araghchi told the forum that this is not a hypothetical scenario, but a trajectory that is visible to anyone willing to look at the facts on the ground. The third consequence, which Araghchi described as perhaps the most dangerous, is structural. He argued that Israel's expansionist project requires neighboring countries to be weakened militarily, technologically, economically, and socially, so that, in his words, the Israeli regime permanently enjoys the upper hand. He pointed to what he called a system of enforced inequality, where Israel expands its military arsenal without limits, including weapons of mass destruction outside any inspection regime, while other countries are demanded to disarm, pressured to reduce defensive capacity, punished for scientific progress, and sanctioned for building resilience. Araghchi argued that this is not arms control, but what he called the enforcement of permanent inequality. He described Israel's strategic doctrine as one of domination, where one state must maintain a permanent military and intelligence edge while all others remain vulnerable. The statement drew particular attention given the ongoing tensions between Iran and the United States over Tehran's missile program and nuclear activities, with Washington insisting that Iran's defensive capabilities should be part of any future agreement. The foreign minister then moved to a series of specific demands that constituted the most concrete and actionable portion of the address. He called on the international community to support legal mechanisms without hesitation, including ongoing proceedings at the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, where cases related to the situation in Palestine are already under review. He called for comprehensive and targeted sanctions against Israel, including an immediate arms embargo, the suspension of all military and intelligence cooperation, restrictions on Israeli officials involved in what he described as violations of international law, and broad trade bans. He demanded a credible political horizon grounded in law, including the end of occupation, the right of return for Palestinian refugees and compensation in accordance with international law, and the establishment of what he described as a unified and independent Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital. The demands echo positions that Iran has held for decades, but the specificity and the forum in which they were delivered gave them particular weight. The Jazeera Forum, which draws diplomats, analysts, and media from across the Arab and Muslim world, provided Araghchi with a platform to frame Iran's position not as an outlier, but as representative of a broader regional consensus. Several speakers at the same forum expressed similar concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the erosion of international legal norms, according to Al Jazeera's coverage. On the humanitarian front, Araghchi said the crisis must be treated as a matter of urgent international responsibility and warned that collective punishment must never be normalized. He pointed to the blockade of Gaza, the destruction of hospitals and schools, and what he described as the weaponization of food and water as evidence that the international community has failed to uphold its most basic obligations under the Geneva Conventions. He called on regional states to coordinate in order to protect sovereignty and deter aggression, stating that security cannot be built on the insecurity of others, a phrase that echoed language Tehran has used repeatedly in the context of its own defense posture and its resistance to demands that it dismantle its missile program. The speech concluded with a direct appeal to the Islamic world, the Arab world, and what Araghchi called the nations of the global South. He urged the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Arab League, and regional organizations to move beyond symbolism toward coordinated action, including legal support, diplomatic initiatives, economic measures, and strategic messaging. He framed this not as confrontation, but as preventing the region from being reshaped by force. Notably, he singled out the global South as an emerging bloc with a collective weight to challenge what he described as a Western-dominated international order that applies rules selectively. Araghchi's closing warning was directed at what he described as those who miscalculate. He said a region cannot be kept stable by allowing one actor to act above the law, and that the doctrine of impunity will not produce peace but wider conflict. He stated that the path to stability requires justice for Palestine, accountability for crimes, an end to occupation, and a regional order built on sovereignty, equality, and cooperation. According to Araghchi, Palestine is not merely a cause for solidarity. It is, in his words, the indispensable cornerstone of regional security. The speech comes at a particularly sensitive moment. Iran and the United States are engaged in fragile nuclear negotiations mediated by Oman, with both sides signaling that the alternative to diplomacy is a return to military confrontation. Araghchi's framing of the Palestinian issue as inseparable from the broader regional security architecture, including Iran's right to maintain its missile capabilities, reflects Tehran's consistent position that its defense posture and its support for the Palestinian cause are two sides of the same coin. The repeated references to permanent inequality and the demand that other nations not be forced to disarm, while Israel maintains an unchecked arsenal, were widely interpreted as a direct commentary on the pressure Iran faces in nuclear and missile talks with Washington. Regional analysts say the Doha address was calibrated to rally diplomatic support from the global South, while